Hello fellow programmers, welcome to Jungle Code. My name is Jan and today I want to show you how I do serverless using infrastructure as code with the help of the Pulumi CLI and SDK. So let's jump straight in right after the requirements. Okay, so the requirements for this tutorial is first you need an AWS account, of course, but the free account, the free tier will be sufficient for what we're doing. Okay, so I just now realized that sadly Route 53 is not included in AWS's free offerings, not at all. Secondly, you need the AWS CLI version 2 installed, and I will put the link, of course, in the video description as well. And third, you need the Pulumi CLI link to the installation instructions in the description as well. And you don't need a Pulumi account for this tutorial, but you can use it, and I will explain where you have to log in. So once you're done with the requirements, we can go to explain a little bit the difference between those two folders. So we are in the Pulumi AWS directory. Within that I have two directories, which are the actual Pulumi projects, like the distinct infrastructure as code services we're going to use. And I'm explaining later why this makes, at least for me, a lot of sense. It makes stuff much easier later on when you add more services and or want to change a service. Okay, so first we head down to the terminal. We have to log in to Pulumi, and here you can, if you use the Pulumi service, I believe, I haven't used it myself, you just use the command Pulumi login, and then it should open the browser, I believe. There you can log into the website, to your account. It'll redirect, and then your CLI is essentially connected to your account. But I'm using the local backend state management, and in this case log into this local file directory, which is the parent of the Pulumi project. So essentially this will, because the projects are in those subdirectories, will live in the Pulumi AWS directory, but you can see this in just a second. So we log in, Pulumi, log in, hit enter. Now we're logged in on the machine, done, and to this local directory. Next thing will be going into the infra directory. Just as an info, so when you get the code, those directories from the repository on GitHub, which I will upload, of course, where you can get all the files, then this is not necessary. But if you want to start a new project, then you can make a new directory, Pulumi example, for example. Okay, Pulumi example, we change directory into Pulumi example, and then there is a command Pulumi new, and then you have to define the template it'll use to scaffold essentially a new project. In this case it's the AWS cloud, and using the Typescript language. Pulumi provides other clouds and other languages as well. You can find all those available templates on the website pulumi.com in their documentation. When you hit enter, it should, now it asked us some questions. We just go with the defaults and the passphrase. Confirm. And now we have to enter the third time for Pulumi to be able to use it. US East region. Now it's in my case using yarn to install the dependencies, because I have somewhere there's an environment variable Pulumi prefer yarn, I believe, which I have set in my zshrc config file. But if you haven't set it, it'll just use npm, which is of course fine as well. Okay. I will skip this for now because we don't need. Actually, we don't need those. This Pulumi example. I'll delete this. And we can delete this in this case too. So, okay, let's start clean now that we know how to scaffold a new project. So, as mentioned before, I have split up the projects. There's AWS infra, and it has already the Pulumi YAML, which is like the kind of the package.json from Pulumi, right? Where you name the project and which runtime to use and have a description. But to actually use this project, you have to generate a new stack. For this, we go back down to the terminal, change directory into infra. Now, infra, and here we have to Pulumi stack init, and then we have to define to name our stack. And you can have as many stacks per project as you want. For example, as you see in this right here, I called it .dev. Usually, and I believe when you use the Pulumi service, you can just init or name your stack like directly like dev, because Pulumi will distinguish between all your projects and stacks and relations and stuff. But because we use the local backend, I found it to be at least easier and probably required to prefix the actual stack with the project name, in this case infra, so one project can require and include resources from another project. So in this case we call it infra.dev, and then we can have infra.prod, infra. I don't know, staging, whatever you want to call them, whatever your requirements are. So in this case we go for infra.dev. So now we have to enter a passphrase to protect our secrets in the configuration, and Pulumi will create this .pulumi directory in the Pulumi AWS directory. This is what I meant when I said that Pulumi login, we logged into the parent directory of the project. So now, as we are in the Pulumi AWS infra directory, the actual backend and Pulumi directory, where it stores the stacks and your resources, will be in the Pulumi AWS directory. And in here, we can see that it's basically empty and just knows its name and the version. So usually you don't have to interact with the stacks. So, okay, we have made our first stack, and you can see it has the Pulumi infra.dev.yaml, and right now there's only the encryption salt, but as I have written in the README, we need to get started some Pulumi config settings. So we're going over them, and we need an origin domain, and for our dev stack we go for localhost 8000 because the web app I'm using is running on 8000, but it could be also just just the star, for example. Origin domain is for core settings essentially, so our API can, or our web app can communicate with our API, which lives on another domain. Then we need Pulumi config API domain api.com. Pulumi config set domain.com and Pulumi config contact email contact@domain.com. And when we go back to our dev stack, we can see all the defined config settings variables in the stack file, in the YAML file. Okay, so the actual Pulumi file is index.ts because we chose the Typescript runtime, and this is where you define your infrastructure. And you can split them, of course, up as you wish. I have, for example, we could put the config directly in here, but I've put them in config.ts and exported, for example, my tags I want to use, which is essentially just a project for now and the stack name, but you can, of course, have more or different tags. The region, which we have not yet set, we of course have to define, and we have to set the AWS region. In this case we use the default one. Okay, so our stack is ready. So we export the region, the origin domain, and the So essentially just export the configuration, go back to index, can close this for now. So now to the actual infrastructure. What we're doing here, first we define our API domain in Route 53, and because in my case the web app lives in Netlify, and I have the name servers set up via Netlify, so the domain name servers point to Netlify. So the base domain, domain.com for example, is managed by Netlify. And to make my life easier, I have one API domain, api.domain.com for example, which I just have to once point to the name servers of Route 53 and don't have to manually change those if I don't change the infra project. And that's exactly one of the reasons why it's good to split the projects up, infra and contact for example, because I can define my API domain, which usually shouldn't change too often or probably not at all, and don't have to mess with it again once it's set up. And the same goes for some SES simple email service settings, for example DynamoDB, stuff like this, which might even be interesting to split up in another project. So the cool thing about Pulumi is that it's actually just code. So to show you an example, it's pretty neat to, for example, say okay AWS, and then the IntelliSense should kick in and show you everything available. And when we go okay Route 53, we can say we need a new zone, and then it'll show us what we have to define. Name, then the arguments. And when we hit on Mac, at least in my key settings, control space, it'll show me the required or available arguments I have to define for Route 53 for a zone, Route 53 zone. So in this case, we just need the name, which is the domain name, and we get it from config, which I abbreviated CFG, API domain, and I added tags. I'm still not like an AWS expert myself yet, but I heard it's nice to tag everything taggable, so we just do it. And with this, we're all set with our base domain Route 53. When we deploy our project, it'll then commission basically all the resources. And for Route 53 to work, you then have to manually go there in the console, or I can show you how to make them visible in the console. And you have to manually go to your domain provider if it's not Route 53, and set the name servers to those provided by Route 53, of course, for it to work. Okay, SES, Amazon Simple Email Service. You can have an email identity, which is, for example, email@domain.com. It's like an actual email. And you can then use this email address to send emails via SES. And we set it to config contact email. That's already we have to do. And when you deploy this for the first time, SES will send you an email to this email address. So you have to be able to receive emails in this inbox and click a link to approve it, that you're the owner, and allow SES to send emails in your name. I'm also using a domain identity, which in this case is defined as the mail domain, because, as I told you, the base domain, domain.com, is managed by Netlify in my case, and the API domain will be api.domain.com. I have a separate mail domain, which is domain.com, to be able to send newsletters at domain.com and not have to send them from api.mail.com. But those settings, or how you prefer to do it, depends, of course, on your requirements and preferences. And then we set SES to use DKIM to improve deliverability. To make our lives easier, because we have to define those DKIM tokens as CNAME DNS records in our DNS provider, we make a new array. And this code is essentially coming from the Pulumi documentation, because there's like 3 records. So this is just a for loop set to loop 3 times, and then we get the DNS records from the SES domain DKIM, what Pulumi returns when it deploys this resource. So those will be defined at runtime, and those are Pulumi outputs. As you can see here, Pulumi output. So it's kind of like a promise, like just to give you an idea, because right now there is no return, and neither do we nor Pulumi knows right now what it will be, because those will be defined by AWS once it's deploying. So so that's why they set it to Pulumi output. So as I said, it's kind of like a promise, and you have to then, to be able to use it in your code for static properties, actually, you have to apply it to get the actual value. In this case, we transform kind of the value to this CNAME name, and here again, just slightly different to the value, which is like always the same, just those tokens change, and the mail domain, of course, depends on your own settings. And then when Pulumi runs this code, it sees those Pulumi output request kind of, and knows, okay, this part of the code depends on this to run first. So this Pulumi is quite good at managing the dependencies of the resources. It makes a plan first and orders the resources, how it deploys them based on the dependencies. So in this case, this part will run only after the SES Domain DKIM resource has been deployed and Pulumi knows the result. Then it goes next, creates of course a new, that's just Typescript, creates a new array, loops over it, and resolves those promise-like Pulumi outputs to the actual value. And why we're doing this is so we can then in the console, when we later, and I show you how it looks, deploy our project, it'll show us the DNS records, so we don't actually have to go to the AWS console to get all the DNS settings we have to manually define in our domain provider. The same goes for DNS Zone, like for the Route 53 for the API domain. We can show them on the console and don't have to go to the AWS console. Next up, to improve deliverability, not an email expert, but what I read on all the suggestions and by AWS as well, it's good to have a MailFrom domain. So this is not exactly required to send emails using SES, but it's said to have better deliverability. Yeah. So I just follow the recommendations, right? So we add a MailFrom domain. MailFrom in this case, just to clarify, is not what, when you send, for example, a newsletter, you have a from domain. The receiver of the email of your newsletter sees the sending domain, of course. But this, in this case, the MailFrom is not what the receiver sees as the sender, as the domain, but this is an internal, which most email providers hide as another from domain. I put a link down in the description to explain this in more detail. Where the differences are explained. So I just followed it because it's recommended. The MailFrom domain. We set the MailFrom domain. Pulumi interpolate is a way of interpolating Pulumi output. So we set the domain to domain identity. Let's go back. Domain identity is defined here. We have AWS SES Domain Identity. This is will be the result, and we can use this result in the MailFrom. So again, Pulumi sees, okay, the MailFrom resource depends on the domain identity resource, so it'll deploy the domain identity resource first, and then all its dependents. And when it comes to the MailFrom, it knows the domain identity and can resolve the domain, which again is a Pulumi output, to its actual string. So similar to a promise, as I said, and then stuff it in here and deploy the MailFrom resource. And next we can get set the MX records for our MailFrom domain, because as we have set the MailFrom domain to be a subdomain of our API domain, so it's actually a subdomain, we don't have to manually set the MX records on our domain provider, but can let Pulumi deploy the or set the MX records in Route 53 on our API domain, which is from the DNS zone, and the DNS zone, when we go back, is the output of our Route 53 zone resource. So this is pretty cool. And if in my case right now. So when you are able to, or when you host your domain in Route 53, for example, or if you're able to manage at least every part of your domain, like the base domain, domain.com, the apex domain, completely in Route 53, then you only have to manually define the Route 53 name servers in your domain provider and can have Pulumi manage everything automatically for you. And if the domain lives in Route 53, so you don't have a separate domain provider, but using Route 53 as a domain provider, which you can do as well, then you don't have to do anything manually and can have Pulumi automate everything for you and set all the DNS records for you automatically, which is pretty cool. Then you can just destroy the stack and recreate the stack whenever you want to, and or like have as many stacks as you want to without ever having to go to some external DNS configurations and manually define them. I hope you get what I'm talking about. So next we define we deploy the text TXT records, DNS records for SPF, which is another, I forgot the name for this as well, but I link it in the description, for better email deliverability for AWS SES. So this is just recommendations and best practices here. And this, I came up with it myself to essentially write the DNS records in DNS Records.json file after everything has deployed. Pulumi.all is kind of like promise all. You can here define an array of Pulumi outputs, like the Pulumi output I showed you before, and it'll run only if all those outputs have resolved already, and then you can on those all resolved outputs apply, which is kind of promise.then, and in the same order get those results. I abbreviated them: domain identity ID, domain identity verification token, this is DKIM, and this is name service, and then I JSON stringify them in an array into this file, so I can come back later and see the settings and copy paste them to my domain provider. And there is already the DynamoDB, which we are not going into right now because we don't need it for the contact form. Okay, what have we changed in this file? Just this. Okay, we save it and we close this one. Okay, so this is essentially the whole infrastructure here the infrastructure from our infra project. And in the infra project, there's nothing more. When we go into package.json, and I define myself helper scripts to deploy to various stacks. The development stack will set the Pulumi prefer yarn, because I want to use yarn for my projects for the dependencies, and as a helper I set the node environment, node env, to development. Pulumi up is the actual command you use to deploy, and usually you can just, you can just hit Pulumi up and you're good to go. But in this case I made the helper to define those environment variables using crossenv, and then to define the proper stack, because this is one point I find a little bit not convenient enough in the Pulumi CLI right now. Pulumi up is using the current stack, and it's not so easy like with Git branches when you show them in your terminal line here, or for example Visual Studio Code shows it down here. Right now this is not a Git repository, but I will convert it soon. So you have to go to stack list and see the asterisk is indicating the current stack. So when we do Pulumi up, it'll deploy the infra.dev stack. When we have more stacks in here, we can then select another stack, but this is, I don't like it. So you can define the -- stack argument on the Pulumi up command and manually define the stack. So I made the helper script and to define the environment variables, as I said before. And then I have the development and the production script. So I can just run yarn deploy development, for example, autocomplete. And it'll deploy the correct stack for me. So let's okay. So, and because it's just code, as you can see in dependencies, we can use ESLint, Prettier, and all our tools we are used to. This is what I love a lot about Pulumi. So let's see what happens if we run yarn deploy development and actually deploy we have to define our passphrase of the stack we entered when we've run Pulumi stack init. And the first thing it'll do is, as you can see here, plan your infrastructure, which is not actually doing anything but just planning and showing you what it will do if you say yes to it, if you allow it to. And this can take a few seconds depending on your infrastructure, on your internet connection, which here is sometimes quite slow, and on the size of the infrastructure, of course. So, and another mention right here. So right now this looks pretty good. There are some problems I ran into where the planning phase would show all green, all to create or update, and when actually hitting yes, do you want to perform this update, then I ran into some errors. So it's not 100% sure that when those are green, that it'll work as expected. So we do yes and see what happens. Crossing fingers. Creating. There you can see the email identity, for example, has already been created. Domain identity has been created. MailFrom has been created, and domain DKIM has been created. Only left is the Route 53 zone. And then, as you can see, it doesn't even show the Route 53, the DNS records, because those depend on the zone. So only if the zone has been created, now the DNS records are creating. And this should be the last two remaining tasks for Pulumi to do. And then we can head over to the AWS Console, and then I can show you what it did. Yay! Okay, so this is the output of Pulumi. All good, everything green, no errors. Resources 8 have been created. That's the time it took, which is most likely to be because of my wonky slow jungle internet connection. And you can see the stuff it to explain here what it shows here in the output. The output depends on actually what you export. So let's check out what have we exported. We have exported all from our config. So what is showing here is actually the same stuff as we have here, defined here. And we're exporting those. We don't actually have to export anything, but we export those to make them available to our contact project later, where we want to depend on the API domain, so we don't have to redefine it again and again, but it can just get it from the infra project, whatever is used there. Okay, so those are our configs. Those 8 have been created. There's a permalink where the stack file has been stored. So let's head over to the AWS Management Console. Okay, let's go first to Route 53 and check our zone Pulumi has created for us. There are 3 zones. Oh yeah, interesting. Oh yeah. So, as you can see, managed by Pulumi, our api.domain.com. Whoops. I had opened the api.domain.com, and here you can see the DNS records as well. So those two are part of the zone itself, and those two are added from our MailFrom or for our MailFrom domain, which is already also deployed and set by Pulumi. So we don't have to define them ourselves. Those is the Route 53. Let's go to the next, which is SES Sample Email Service. What else have we done? Index, Route 53, yeah, email identity. So in here, Virginia, that should be the correct. Always important to check that you're in the right region, of course, because otherwise you won't find anything. There are a few exceptions. Route 53, for example, is global, so there is no region to choose. And here we go, we check the email identity first, which is contact@domain.com. And as I told you, it's pending verification. So whoever's owner of domain.com and in charge of the contact email will have received the verification email from SES, where you have to click the link to actually verify it. So this will only be verified once you have clicked the verification link, of course. But we will destroy the stack soon, and then, or actually after the contact project, because and it depends of course on this. And then the domains, domain.com, pending verification. As I told you, to verify this one, we have to set DNS records in our DNS provider, which we wrote to the DNS Records JSON file. So those are all the name server records we have to define in our DNS provider, and those are DKIM for Amazon SES DKIM, and this is the verification for the domain itself, for the SES domain, Amazon SES, the text record. So once you set this entry in your DNS provider's config, this will turn green, and once you have at those 3 CNAME records, this will turn green. And yeah, the Route 53 doesn't show a verified or non-verified indicator, so yeah, this is actually all there is to the infra for now. That's it for today. Next up will be the contact form service, followed by the newsletter subscription service. So stay tuned, hit subscribe if you don't want to miss the next episode. Thanks for watching. See you soon.